Hey guys, it's Rational Press here. So the New York Times did a op-ed video about how America wasn't really the greatest country in the world, even though America constantly claims to be. And Freedomtoons decided to launch a response video. But when they did the response video, they did a bunch of ridiculous talking points and just flat-out inaccuracies in their response, and we're going to go through a few of them. And a lot of these are just either totally false or they're just completely misreading the data. So, yeah, let's begin. So, okay.
As am I. The two of us are sick and tired of dealing with.
But what if we did question it? Now, hold on, Patriots. I know what you're thinking. America's done some pretty great stuff. And you're right. We built a kick-ass democracy.
Watch your language, young man. We don't say the D word around here. Yes, and neither did the founders. They built a republic after all.
What?
Okay, so the first point that they made is that the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. And that's just... Conservatives usually use that talking point, but it's such a ridiculous and basically misinformed talking point that shows that they don't really know what they're talking about. The United States is both a democracy and a republic, because a republic is a form of a democracy. The United States is not a direct democracy where voters directly vote on issues, but it is a democracy in the sense that we democratically vote for representatives that do the things that we want. So let's see. So it says right here, this is PolitiFact. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning fact checker, and it says, and it rates Paul Ryan's claim in 2016. The United States is the oldest democracy in the world, and it rates it as true. So to look at this article, it says democracy versus republic. It says the founding fathers feared direct democracy, which involves people deciding directly on policy initiatives and regarded it as an ill-advised form of government. They feared tyranny of the majority as much as that of a king. So here, they feared direct democracy. Instead, they created what is typically referred to as a representative democracy or republic. The people elect leaders who make decisions on their behalf with a system that protected minority rights. Over the years, the differences between democracies, both representative and direct, the republics have been hotly debated by political scholars. For our purposes, we will broadly consider a democratic state to be in which power is vested in the people who rule themselves or are governed by those who they elect. In the New York Times, it was reported in a 2019 article, Is the United States a Democracy?, talking about how different states view whether the United States is a democracy or a republic in their history classes in high school. And it says, while the founders were indeed skeptical of direct democracy, mainstream historians, political scientists, and legal scholars say that the United States is both a representative democracy and a republic, that there is no contradiction between these terms. A democracy is government by the people, which may rule either directly or indirectly through elected representatives. A republic is a form of government in which the people's elected representatives make decisions. So, a republic is a form of a democracy. The United States is both a republic and a democracy. There's no contradiction between those. The United States is not a direct democracy, but it is still a democracy.
The moon, and we built universities so prestigious that, of course, there's no single way. Some diversity, too. Club of 36 countries. But one good test is how we rank in the OECD, which is basically a golf club of 36 countries, predominantly wealthy, Western, and democratic. And unlike most golf clubs, this one's got some diversity, too. America is the richest country in this club, but we're also the poorest, with a whopping 18% poverty rate.
Oh, I was waiting for you to say something wrong. My good sir, poverty statistics are calculated based on the median income of a country. Yes, indeed. If you earn 60% of the median income of your nation or less, you're counted as being at or below the poverty line, meaning what's considered poor in one country may be considered middle class in another. Indeed, if the median income in a country was $1 million, then anyone who made $600,000 or less would be considered poor. Yes, and speaking of relatively poor people in a truly rich country having a higher standard of living than most people throughout the world, the so-called poverty line in the U.S. is actually roughly equal to or higher than the median income in many OECD countries, such as Israel, Japan, Italy, Spain, Poland, Belgium, Ireland, Greece, Hungary, and more. In fact, only 3 OECD countries have wealthier poor people than the U.S. does.
Closer to
Okay, so there are many things to debunk here. So his main source for this claim is an article from the Mises Institute, which is a sort of a libertarian right-wing think tank. It's not exactly a reliable source. I mean, they did one article in which they said that you should legalize drunk driving because alcohol only increases the risk of an accident, but it doesn't guarantee it. So therefore, we should have the freedom to consume however much alcohol you want, and you can still drive your car. So it's not exactly the most reliable source, but this is the article right here. The poor in the U.S. are richer than the middle class in much of Europe. So it shows this chart here. It shows the poverty income level in the U.S. versus median income level in other countries. And it shows the poverty level here in the U.S., which is about 18,000. I think this is for 2014, and it shows the median income of all these countries, and it shows that, well, look, being middle class in many European countries is the equivalent of being in poverty in the United States. But that's extremely misleading because, yes, we have higher incomes than all of these other countries, but we also have more expenses. So let's take a look. So we have we have higher income, but we also have more expenses. We have one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the modern industrialized world. We spend this is adjusted for 2017, we spent $10,224 per capita in U.S. dollars. This is adjusted for 2017, and this is one of the most expensive healthcare systems in the modern industrialized world, with all of these other countries paying less than we do. So, yes, we have higher income, but we also have more expenses. When you look at college costs in America, so right here, this is a 2017 article in The Atlantic. Why is college in America so expensive? Right here, okay, today the U.S. spends more on college than almost any other country, according to the 2018 Education at a Glance report released this week by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So all told, including the contribution of individual families and the government in the form of student loan grants and other assistance, Americans spend about $30,000 per student a year, nearly twice as much as the average developed country. The U.S. is in a class of its own, says Andreas Schlager, the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, and he does not mean this as a compliment. Spending per student is exorbitant, and it has virtually no relationship to the value that students could possibly get in exchange. So let me show you the chart of U.S. Okay, right here. So this is the OECD chart, and it says total expenditure on educational institutions per full-time equivalent student. This is all tertiary, so third-level education. So that would be college costs. And the United States, right here, spends $30,003 per full-time equivalent student on education, which is twice the OECD average, and many other countries spend less than we do. So, for example, Germany spends about $17,000. Let's see, and Japan spends $19,000. Netherlands spends $19,000, and New Zealand spends $15,000. Norway $20,000. Sweden $24,000. Basically, the only real country that spends more than us is I'm pretty sure Luxembourg, right here, which is $48,000. So all these other countries spend less than we do, and we spend about twice per capita per education than the OECD average. So, and if you look at other costs such as childcare costs, we have higher household income, but we spend a higher percentage of that income paying for childcare. So we spend about 31.8% of our household income on paying for childcare, the cost of having children, daycare and all that other stuff. So these are gross child care fees. All right. Okay. Yes. So we spend 31.8. The OECD total is 13% of household income. So we spend more than twice the OECD total. And you have many other countries. France spends 11.6%. Norway spends 6.3%. Iceland spends 4.6. Germany spends 4.5. Korea, 2% of household income is spent on childcare. So, again, we have more income, but we also have more expenses. So there's a June 5th, 2017 article from the Pew Research Center that compares the Western Europe's middle class to America's middle class. So what it did was it took the U.S. definitions of poverty and the U.S. definitions of middle class, not exactly poverty, but lower income households, and the U.S.'s definition of the middle class, and tried to apply it to Europe. And these are the results. So, for example, when you take Denmark, Denmark claims to have 80% of its households living in middle-income households. But when you when you view it through the lens of how the U.S. views a middle-income household, the percent declines to 70%. So from a U.S. perspective, only 70% of households in Denmark are middle income, I guess, but again, that's still higher than the U.S., which is 59%. Finland still higher than the U.S. France still higher than the U.S. Germany still higher than the U.S. Let's see. Luxembourg still higher than the U.S. Obviously. Netherlands still higher than the U.S. UK does slightly worse than the U.S. Spain does worse. Italy does worse. But you have many other countries who do better, even if you define middle income from a U.S. perspective. If you define lower income through a U.S. perspective, the number of lower income households increases. But it increases. So for example, Germany has slightly more lower income households than the U.S., but they also have slightly more middle income households as well. France, again, has slightly more lower income households than the U.S., but they also have slightly more, not only slightly more, but yeah, they also have slightly more middle income households. So you have to look at these things with fair comparison. But even this article is a little bit misleading, because when you read the bottom of the article, it says right here, but to the extent that governments in Western Europe are more likely to provide services to households that may not be captured in household income, such as the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, it is possible that the differences in the quality of life between the U.S. and Western Europe are narrower. So we have more income, but we also have more expenses. And when you do and a lot of these comparisons aren't really fair, because people in Western Europe get a lot of services that the United States doesn't get. So I was still a little bit, disturbed by this graph here, because it seemed to portray that, for example, that living in poverty in the United States is very similar to being middle class in the United Kingdom. So I was a little bit disturbed by this graph here. The graph is right here. Disturbed by this graph, by this article, the Mises Institute. So I decided to email Jeffrey Sachs. He's a Harvard economist, a public policy analyst. No, he's not a Harvard. I think he's done work at Harvard before, but right now he's the director at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He is known as one of the world's leading experts on economic development and the fight against poverty. So I decided to email him with this article, asking him whether this article was accurate, and he actually responded. And it says right here, this is his article. It says this is his response to whether the article was accurate. He says, "This article seems to be wrong on so many counts that it's worthy of a term paper. It would take some careful study to check and verify all of these mistakes, but let me mention some of the possible errors. First, it seems to have the wrong poverty line for the U.S. It depicts the U.S. poverty line at around 18,000 for 2014, which would have been the poverty line for a household of around 3 persons. But the OECD median income data that reported here seems to be the median income per person, not per household. It seems to come from household data, but it seems to be adjusted to be per person. So he apparently finds some sort of mismeasurement in how the Mises Institute measured median income data. So right here, he talked about how a lot of the European countries that are poor are post-communist, and they don't really represent a lot of the total EU population. They shouldn't. It's not really fair to count them. These countries include the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Estonia, Hungary, etc. Again, and as I said, third EU citizens receive benefits of government services far higher than those that are recorded in the data as shown. The social benefits actually measured in the data as shown seem not to include healthcare, higher education, public transport, or public housing. That's because the social benefits category only includes direct transfers to households in income or in kind, and not health services, free higher education. So the way the OECD the way the OECD measures social benefits is cash transfers, not receiving healthcare or receiving higher education. They only measure social benefits in terms of sort of cash transfer, direct transfers to households. So that's a bit misleading because you might not receive sort of cash benefits or direct transfers from the government, but you do receive free services or subsidized services that are much cheaper than what you would get in the United States. And it also says, fourth, the data show nothing about the quality of life in the U.S. poor versus the quality of life of the EU median individuals. Yet the EU median individuals have more leisure time per year, paid family leave, paid sick leave, guaranteed health care, free or nearly free higher education, active labor market policies, including job retraining, and countless other social benefits. So it says, thank you for bringing this article to my attention. So this was from Jeffrey Sachs, who was a leading expert on poverty and economic development, and he said the article was totally inaccurate because, again, we have higher incomes, but we also have more expenses on basic things such as education, healthcare, childcare, and things of that nature. And being in the EU and being in Europe, many European countries have more leisure time per year, paid family leave, paid sick leave, more active labor market policies, and other social benefits as well. So that's why it's extremely misleading to just look at income and say that the United States is a wealthier country. So let me do so. Let's go on the next thing of misleading talking points. So we go here.
Well, science, we're 19th of 36. Reading in American children live in poverty. That's almost 1 in 5 of our kids. And speaking of kids, turns out at the level of high school science, we're 19th of 36. Reading, 20th. And math, a dismal 30th.
Yes, the public school system is wonderful, isn't it? Interestingly enough, in the 1960s and 70s, the US had the best educated students in the world. But then in 1979, the federal government saw how well things were going and decided there needed to be a solution. And the Department of Education was formed. From that point onward, rather than letting local school systems develop their own curriculums, as they had been doing, the federal government centralized and nationalized educational standards to a much stronger degree. And since then, educational spending has increased much faster than inflation, and the U.S. has fallen farther and farther behind each year. And yet, I have a hunch that he may be trying to make the case for more centralized authority and state bureaucracy than less.
Now,
okay, so there's so much misleading things here. Freedomtoons has a habit of doing this. He did it on a previous video that where he talked about healthcare, and he did the same exact thing. He says something, but then if you look at his list of sources, what he's saying is not what the source that he's citing says. So what does he say? He says that we were the global leaders in education. Then the Department of Education was formed, and then U.S. test scores have been falling because of the Department of Education, and they've been falling ever since the Department of Education has been created. So his source for this is this website right here. It's aarp.org. It's this article, Boomers Once Led the World in Education, What Happened? And it says right here, in the 1960s and 70s, the United States had the best educated young people in the world, or pretty close to it, but a disturbing new report from the Council on Foreign Relations says the generations who follow the boomers haven't been able to maintain that global edge, and that, as a result, Americans' ability to compete economically is suffering as well. So this entire article does not mention the Department of Education. It doesn't mention anything about the Department of Education. It doesn't mention it being built. It doesn't mention that the reason why test scores have been going down is because of the Department of Education. It doesn't mention when the specific date when test scores started going down and why they went down. It doesn't mention anything. But so why is Freedomtoons talking about the Department of Education if none of the sources even mention the Department of Education? So if you go through this entire article right here, it says about how younger Americans are entering college at a higher rate, and how the astronomical rise in tuition costs. I've mentioned how we spend more on college than other countries. And how they've increased, and that might discourage people from entering and accessing college education. But this entire article does not mention the Department of Education. It does not mention Department of Education, and it does not say that scores were going down after the Department of Education was built, and that it was because of the Department of Education. So if you look at this article right here from the Brookings Institution, it was written in Friday, April 7, 2017. It says, what international test scores reveal about American education? So this article talks about how international test scores are measured. They're measured using the PISA exams and the TIMSS exams. Both of these exams the PISA exam was first administered in 2000, which was way after the 1970s when the Department of Education was built. And the TIMS exams were made. Let me see when they were made. U.S. test scores on the TIMS were from 1995 to 2015. So there's no. So both of these exams were administered after the 1970s when the Department of Education was formed. The only way you would prove that the Department of Education caused low test scores is looking at test scores before the Department of Education was formed, and looking at test scores after the Department of Education was formed. And if there's a drop, then you can maybe speculate that the decline in test scores is because of the Department of Education. But even then, you haven't proved that it's causal. You've only proved that test scores fell after the Department of Education was formed, not because of the Department of Education. So again, another reason why this article that Freedomtoons gave you is misleading is because his source has a source. It's a report from the Council on Foreign Relations. So let's go to the report. It's a Council on Foreign Relations article written in 2016 by Edward Alden. So it looks at about how the U.S. education system is falling compared to the rest of the world. And let's see, right here, it says scorecard from the Council on. It says, quote right here, the real scourge of the U.S. education system and its greatest competitive weakness is the deep and growing achievement gap between socioeconomic groups that begins early and lasts through the student's academic career. So it's because of different socioeconomic levels that we have a low-performing education system. So let's go here. Although the United States spends the fifth most on the world on per-student primary and secondary education, and by far the most on college education, these funds are not distributed equitably. The majority of developed countries invest more resources per pupil in low-income school districts than in higher-income ones. It is the reverse in the United States in large part because local property taxes provide most revenues for K-12 public schools. The investment gap continues in college and has increased significantly over time. Here. So it's talking about how socioeconomic differences is the majority of the reason why the United States has low test scores. This entire article does not mention the Department of Education. The Council on Foreign Relations article does not mention the Department on Education. So Freedomtoons has no basis in talking about the Department of Education if he's not going to mention a source that talks about the Department of Education. The Council on Foreign Relations articles even mentions the Obama administration's record for taking on education inequality is mixed, writes Strauss. It has set an ambitious agenda for educational policy that pushes for more accountability, yet funding decisions have taken federal policy in the wrong direction. The major federal programs for disadvantaged students are said to be cut back as part of sequestration, while several budgetary changes, particularly in higher education student aid, disproportionately favor the wealthy. So the article itself says that cuts to federal funding make it harder for disadvantaged students to get ahead. So almost the exact opposite of what Freedomtoons is claiming is what's happening. Is that when you cut federal funding, that hurts lower income students. And again, this entire article, the Department of Education, is not mentioned. So Freedomtoons has a habit of doing this. He did it previously, where he said that Canada does horrible. Canada's worst on the United States in terms of providing emergency services to patients. And his own source says Canada you have to wait longer to get non-emergency services in Canada than you do in the United States. Not emergency services, which is what he said. So totally and completely misleading from Freedomtoons, and his own source doesn't match up with what he's saying.